The woman who used religious relics to manipulate people and was silenced by them. Do you believe it is possible to deceive others using the name of God and get away with it? She pretended to purify, sold promises, used sacred relics to manipulate those who just wanted a little peace. But everything changed when an object chose not to be sold. From that moment on, the voices began. The mirrors showed what was not hers. And the faith she used as a tool turned into a sentence. If you think that every lie fades away with time, wait until you see what this reliquary has brought to light. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who still believes that playing with the invisible costs nothing. Today, you will understand why some spiritual truths refuse to remain silent. At first, she was just another ordinary-looking woman. Her name was Isabel, and she lived in the back of an old house she inherited from her grandmother, a respected healer in the neighborhood. Her grandmother's fame preceded her, and when Isabel decided to open the Santa Lucia Spiritual Protection House, many residents flocked out of gratitude for the past. But what began as small prayers and blessings soon turned into a business of subtle manipulation disguised as faith. Isabel learned over time to identify weaknesses. She knew when someone came to her out of grief, fear of death, or despair in love. She wore crucifixes covered in salt, ribbons with promises of protection, and images with memorized phrases, but all with a single purpose: make them come back. And they came back. They came back because she said the spiritual cleansing wasn't complete. They came back because she claimed envy was still trapped in the auric field. They came back because they were afraid they wouldn't come back. With each session, more charges arose. Rituals for $500, cleansing baths with secret ingredients for $300, amulets imported from Jerusalem, which in fact she bought on a Chinese website for $2 a dozen. Isabel knew how to sell faith like someone selling healing, and for a time worked. But something was slowly changing inside her. Some nights she dreamed of her grandmother, who stood silently before a lit candle, looking disappointed. Other times she smelled burning herbs, even with everything turned off. The once welcoming atmosphere of the house became stuffy. The ceiling creaked for no apparent reason. Pictures fell from the wall in the early hours, but she carried on. One of his clients, Mrs. Laura, lost her son in a motorcycle accident. Isabel said that the spirit was still nearby, trapped, and that she could lead him to eternal rest. He made her pay everything she had, but Laura returned 2 weeks later thinner with dark circles under her eyes, saying that she now heard her son crying every morning, and he begged her to return to the body. Isabel feigned surprise, gave her another purified rosary, and dismissed her. But that night, it was she who awoke to a deep whisper saying, "You opened a door, now you can't close it." His legs trembled. He ran to the makeshift altar he kept in his room and tried to pray, but he couldn't remember the words. The crucifix he wore around his neck fell to the floor and broke in half. The next day, while meeting a new client, he introduced himself as a historian. He had brought an ancient relic to be blessed, a strange reliquary, with symbols she had never seen before. The man asked her not to sell it or bless it to others. He simply said, "This piece doesn't choose to be with just anyone. If it accepts you, take good care of it." Isabel laughed inwardly, thinking of the money she could make reselling it. But as soon as she touched the object, she felt the floor disappear. The world went silent for a few seconds. And in the back of the room she saw, for a split second, the image of the grandmother with a disapproving look, without saying a word. The walls of the Santa Lucia Spiritual Protection House heard more confessions than any church in the city. Inside, people broke down. Women who had lost children, husbands who feared betrayal, women who felt death approaching in their bones. They all believed that Isabel could be their bridge between the visible and the invisible, but she only listened and then used. She learned over time that fear is stronger than faith, that when someone believes they may be being spiritually persecuted, any dirty look becomes a curse, any headache becomes a burden, any nightmare is a warning. Isabel knew how to sow doubt with surgical precision, and once fear was sown, she sold the cure. But the darkest part of his actions was the silence he imposed. His victims didn't speak to the police, didn't tell their neighbors, didn't report it on social media. They feared what might happen if they broke the spiritual pact. She said that vengeful spirits could revolt, that the evil released in the process needed to be contained until the end, and that, if interrupted, it would return double to anyone who dared to question it. Many believed. Even the most skeptical, faced with pain, lowered their heads, because when the suffering is great, even a well-told lie seems like a promise of relief. A 28-year-old woman named Giovanna lost her mother to terminal cancer. Isabel said her mother's spirit was trapped in the house and needed to be released with a 9-day ritual, using 9 black candles and an offering of something personal. Giovanna took her mother's necklace with her. When she returned on the 10th day, she asked for the necklace back. Isabel simply replied, "It has been accepted. It no longer belongs to this world." 2 weeks later, Giovanna started hearing the doorbell ring at 3:33 a.m., always the same time, always no one on the other end, until one day she opened the door and lying on the floor was Mother's cord box with the lid open and a handwritten note on burnt paper. "You gave me away." That's when Giovanna disappeared from social media. She changed her number. She told her sister she was being watched by something on the other side of the door. She never returned to Casa Santa Lucia, and she wasn't the only one. A man named Olavo, who sought out Isabel to break a separation spell, began vomiting dirt after a coarse salt ritual. He said his bed sank by itself in the early morning, as if someone had lain there. He went to the hospital, which found no diagnosis. He sought out another spiritualist, who refused to see him upon learning who his former guide was. "This woman does not work alone. What is with her did not come from the light." Many wanted to report it, but something held them back. Nightmares, omens, unexplained noises, animals dying in the house, as if Isabel had sealed their names with an oath no one understood. Some said it was black magic, others that it was an ancient spirit she was summoning. But a few, more sensible, swore, "She does not invoke, she hosts." And the reliquary? Ever since that object arrived, something worse had been in the air. Clients stopped receiving text messages. Appointments became vague. Isabel no longer showed up as she used to. When she opened the door, her eyes seemed dull. Her nails grew crooked, and sometimes her lips moved, even when she was silent. But the scariest part was when a group of former clients gathered to talk discreetly. They met at a local beauty salon without revealing names. Only one phrase was uttered in common by 3 different people at different points in the conversation. "We hear her voice, even when she's not around." It was on a muggy autumn Saturday that Elizabeth decided to visit an antiques fair set up in the courtyard of a disused convent. She said she needed to feel the air of objects with history, as if seeking inspiration or raw materials for rituals. But that day, she didn't know she would find something that didn't belong to time or to her. Among rusted record players, rusted candlesticks, and broken images of saints stood a small, dark tent covered in purple and brown velvet. In the center of the table rested a reliquary, oval, gold, with a darkened stain on the metal, as if it had been burned with holy oil. There were Latin inscriptions that seemed corroded by time, and in the center, behind thick glass, a piece of cloth stained red, dried red, ancient red. The seller, a man with aged features and hands that trembled constantly, Eyed the reliquary suspiciously. When Isabel asked the price, he was blunt. "This one is not for sale." She smiled, thinking it was a ploy to inflate the price. "If it's not for sale, why is it on display?" The man lowered his eyes and replied, "Because it needs scuse someone." She thought it was ridiculous but feigned interest. The salesman then approached and, without warning, placed the reliquary in her hands. The moment the object touched her skin, Isabel felt hot and cold at the same time, as if the blood had stopped and then started running again in reverse. Her hands sweated, her eyes filled with tears for no reason, and a deep buzzing echoed in her ears. For a second, everything around her seemed blurry. She saw the salesman's face distort like a distorted reflection and heard, inside her own head, "You see what was hidden, but you cannot hide what you see." She dropped the reliquary and took a step back. It fell to the table with a thud. The man watched her in silence. "Now he's accepted you. You can take it, no charge, but don't try to sell it. Don't try to give it to someone else. He'll know." Isabel left with her heart racing, but inside, something was in a trance. She told herself it was just a suggestion, just a hoax. But she took the reliquary. She wrapped it in a black cloth, locked it in the room where she performed her most intense rituals, and tried to forget it. But the reliquary did not allow himself to be forgotten. On the first night, the candle in the living room lit on its own. On the second, the mirror in the hallway appeared cracked into a cross. On the third, the altar fell and all the objects scattered, except the reliquary. It remained intact, in the center, aligned with the door, pointing toward it. On the fourth morning, he woke with the skin on his arm burning. When he turned on the light, there was a word drawn in red welts, like subtle scratches: "No." She ran to the room where the object was kept, and upon entering, she clearly heard a deep, masculine voice whispering in her ear, "You are not allowed to use it like you used others." Isabel fell to her knees. She tried to pray, but the voice wouldn't let her. It repeated phrases she'd never heard before, but which sounded familiar, in an ancient and cruel language, something between Latin and Sanskrit, like a forgotten prayer from the world of the living. The next morning, she tried to return the reliquary to the vendor. She returned to the convent. The market was gone. No one could tell which stall she was talking about, and when she looked inside her bag, the reliquary was still there, untouched, intact, and with the black cloth torn. That night, as she looked into her own eyes in the mirror, Isabel saw someone behind you, a figure, a face. For a second it was her grandmother, but in the reflection, her grandmother wore black eyes, and she smiled. The wall clock stopped at 3:17. Isabel noticed it only when she woke to a soft but impossible to ignore noise. It wasn't the sound of something falling or wind. It was a prolonged whisper, which seemed to come from every corner of the house at the same time, but also from inside his head. "You are not allowed." She sat up in bed, confused, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door. The voice didn't sound threatening. It was calm, but the tone carried an authority that pierced her skin, an uncomfortable certainty that someone, or something, had entered without having to open doors. The reliquary was locked. Isabel kept it inside a wooden box wrapped in cloth with a cross of Saint Benedict on top, sealed with 3 drops of candle wax. But when she left the room, she noticed that the door to the ritual room was ajar. The wind. There were no open windows. The cloths covering the altar fluttered as if someone had passed by. In the center of the table, the reliquary was no longer covered. It was uncovered, clean, with the glass lid ajar. Inside, the stained cloth looked like redder than before. Touching the object, Isabel felt that warmth again. But this time, something else. A memory that wasn't hers. A battlefield, a bonfire, screams in a language she didn't understand, and a woman with long hair braided with iron thread, screaming amidst the flames. When she released the reliquary, the image disappeared, but the scent of burnt meat stayed in the air for hours. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The altar was tidy. The cross of St. Benedict was intact. The reliquary was in place, as if nothing had happened. Isabel thought she might be going mad. She began to doubt her own sanity. She spent the day in silence without seeing any clients, not even those who already had appointments. But the next morning was worse. She woke up face down with pressure on her back, as if someone were lying on top of her. The whisper returned, this time firmer, closer. "You have been warned." When he managed to turn his face, he saw that the mirror opposite, the bed, was completely covered in a dark mist. Not steam, not smoke. It was as if something blocked the reflection from view. Gradually, letters appeared on the glass, as if written with an invisible finger. "Return what does not belong to you." She ran. She tried to throw the reliquary away, but it kept returning. She burned incense, invoked ancient prayers, and infused it with rue, rosemary, and guinea grass. Nothing worked. And worse, the more she tried to get rid of the object, more presences and felt around you. Over the next few nights, voices began to multiply. They weren't just disconnected phrases. They were stories, pains, memories of people who seemed trapped in that object. Isabel began to write down everything she heard. One of them repeated, "I was used in the name of God," but there was no God there. Other, "She took what was left of me and buried it under a false altar." And a third, more disturbing one, "You know who I am. You have my blood in your body." Little by little, Isabel began to understand. Those voices were not just spiritual victims, they were echoes of past lives. Some are connected to her, others are connected to the reliquary, but all, in some way, are intertwined by the same thread of pain, manipulation, and sacrifice disguised as salvation. On the fifth night, the voice didn't come as a whisper. It came as a scream, and not from outside, but from inside your throat. She woke up screaming words she didn't understand, entire phrases in Latin with ritualistic intonation. When she looked around, there were candles lit, even though she hadn't scratched them. And beside the bed, written on the floor in dried blood, a new sentence. "Now you speak for us." When Isabel woke, the pillow was soaked, but not with sweat, it was blood. A trickle ran from her nose and her gums throbbed as if she'd been beaten. She looked in the mirror and saw no bruises, no scratches, but her entire body ached as if lashed by invisible forces. And yet, she knew she wasn't hurt on the outside. It was as if the pain was coming from inside out, penetrating layers that didn't belong to the flesh. It wasn't a fever. It wasn't anemia. It was something else. Something no doctor would diagnose. It was embodied memory. She tried to ignore it. She drank rue tea, bathed in lavender water, and prayed psalms she barely remembered. She spent the day in silence, but the pain remained, constant, throbbing, as if something were pulsing within her bones. The next night, when she closed her eyes, Isabel saw images she couldn't tell if they were dreams, memories, or fragments of lives that weren't hers. He walked through dark corridors with torches on the walls. He heard muffled screams. He felt the weight of old clothes on his body. There was someone tied to a chair, someone begging, "You said you would save me." But what came next was silence, and then flames. The next day, a strange mark appeared on his forearm. A circle like a burn, but raised, as if it had been carved into his skin. It didn't hurt, but it throbbed like a live signal. Desperate, Isabel decided to do what she feared most, used the reliquary on a client. A man named Silvio, who had been seeking her out for months, claiming to hear his dead mother's voice calling out to him in his sleep. It was the kind of case she knew best. She called it a residual attachment, requiring spiritual reconciliation. This time, however, she would do it differently. He asked Silvio to place his hands on the table and place the reliquary between them. He asked for absolute silence, and when he intoned the opening prayer, the reliquary opened by itself. Silvio froze. His eyes rolled back in his head. He fell to the ground, screaming. Isabel tried to help him, but he didn't respond. His mouth moved silently, as if something were speaking for him. When he finally stopped writhing, he opened his eyes and said in a childish voice, "Why did you burn me?" Isabel recoiled. That wasn't Silvio's voice. It was a child's. At the same moment, the arm that had touched the reliquary twisted on its own, violently. Isabel cried out in pain. A crack echoed inside her shoulder. When she looked at her skin, the circle-shaped mark had duplicated, and now it burned like a red-hot iron. Silvio woke up with no memory of anything, but he never returned. A week later, Isabel learned that he had left town without telling anyone. The voices began to intensify. Now they all spoke together, non-stop, day and night, while she ate, bathed, or even slept, if she still slept. They spoke in disjointed, fragmented sentences, but some repeated themselves clearly. "You trapped us with lies. Now we live through your pain." Isabel lost her appetite. She lost 20 pounds in less than a month. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her nails darkened. Doctors said it was extreme stress, but tests showed nothing serious. No infection, no physical trauma. She smiled silently because she knew it wasn't physical, it was karmic. With each ritual she performed, the pain worsened. With each lie she told, a new symptom emerged. A client she deceived with a protective amulet had an accident and broke her leg. Isabel woke up the next day with a purple leg and a locked knee without ever having fallen. It was as if the reliquary returned everything she falsely gave, as if she became the altar of all the guilt she spread. That night, Isabel didn't pray. She just knelt before the mirror and whispered to herself, "If this is justice, then I'm already dead." And behind her, in the reflection, 10 faces slowly appeared, all with empty eyes, all silent, all waiting. When Isabel realized the symptoms wouldn't subside, she did what she always recommended to others. She intensified her rituals, but this time there was no manual, there was no control. Everything that had once been theatrical became desperation. Prayers were no longer read in a firm voice. Now they came amid sobs, moans, and pleas for forgiveness. She began sleeping, with coarse salt under her pillow, an iron cross at her head, and white candles burning all day long. But the reliquary remained there, motionless, closed, and at the same time present in every room. Isabel developed an obsession, keeping the light on at all times. Any shadow made her shudder. She even removed all the cold lamps in the house and replaced them with handmade candles, as if the firelight were more respected by what haunted her. But as her fear grew, the rituals turned into endless cycles. She began following instructions she couldn't remember coming from. She would wake up to symbols scrawled on the floor in chalk or charcoal that she couldn't remember drawing. In many, she saw features similar to Norse runes or Syriac script. She began memorizing chants that came to her mind in languages she'd never studied. She would record her own voice in the early hours of the morning and, upon listening, she would notice strange phrases chanted like mantras. One of the recordings read, "The flesh bends, but the name remains. As long as the name is spoken, the bond lives." And in another, "3 times your blood cried out for the lie. Now it will be the ink." One night, he tried to repeat the ancient purification rituals, the same ones he used to deceive clients. He lit candles, used salt, and prayed the memorized psalms. But the reliquary, which had previously remained motionless, spun on its own on the table, as if mocking her. It was then that Isabel realized she was no longer the one who commanded the rituals. She was just a conduit. In the following days, she would stand for hours before the altar without moving her body. The candle would burn out completely, and she wouldn't even notice. Her eyes remained still, as if she weren't there. Her body trembled, her face sweated, but her mouth whispered endless prayers. Those watching from the outside said it was like watching someone possessed, but at peace. Neighbors reported seeing strange lights in her window, a purple glow that flickered silently. Some claimed to hear choruses of chanting, as if more than one voice were chanting prayers. But Isabel lived alone. Since the reliquary arrived, no one had slept in the house. She even built a second altar in the backyard. It was filled with stones, leaves, and a wooden stake in the center, surrounded by red lines. There, she buried small pieces of paper, each bearing the names of people she had wronged. It was her way of giving back the pain. But with each name buried, more voices emerged. The forgiveness line was endless. One day at dawn, Isabel appeared lying on the living room floor, uninjured, unbled, but her body trembled as if it were an instrument used beyond its limits. Her eyes open, her mouth half open. When a neighbor found the door ajar and tried to wake her, Isabel merely murmured, "The cross is no longer a cross. It is a crossroads." And he fainted. The neighbor ran away, scared. From then on, the rituals became daily, no longer for clients, no longer for money, but for calm what inhabited the house. Isabel no longer controlled the reliquary, but she seemed to understand its purpose, to channel not only pain, but settling of accounts. One afternoon, he wrote on the mirror in shaky letters, "It's not the spirits that want peace, it's the memories that want justice." And that phrase, for some reason, never erased. No matter how much I wiped it, the mist always brought back the same words, as if the mirror refused to forget. It was a grey Wednesday, with low skies and an unusually dense silence. Isabel wasn't expecting anyone. Since the reliquary's arrival, her customers had disappeared, not for lack of demand, but because she herself had stopped responding. Responding would be futile. The forces she once controlled were now watching her and reacting. The house was no longer hers. But that late afternoon, someone knocked on the door 3 times. She hadn't intended to open it, but her feet walked on their own. As she turned the doorknob, the pain in her left shoulder, right where the circular mark burned, returned with a vengeance. Outside stood a woman wrapped in a navy blue shawl, her hair tied in a loose bun, her eyes sunken like dark wells. She carried a small wooden cross in her hand, not as if seeking protection, but as if demanding something in return. "Do you remember me?" the woman asked. Isabel didn't answer, but she recognized it. It was Camilla, a former client, who had appeared months earlier, devastated after the sudden and inexplicable loss of her husband. At the time, Isabel had convinced her that he had died under the influence of a spiritual separation work, and that a costly ritual would be necessary to close the cycle of grief. Camilla had given away everything: a wedding ring, used clothing, a torn photograph, and finally, a silver reliquary that had belonged to her husband's mother. Isabel didn't remember returning it. Or maybe I had kept it, but now something inside her was twisting. This wasn't a social visit, it was adjustment. "You took something that doesn't belong to you. I dream about it every night. It asks me to get it. The reliquary wasn't mine. It was hers. And you know who I'm talking about?" Isabel tried to deny it, but the golden reliquary, the one that now lived on the altar, trembled alone on the shelf, as if recognizing the name that hung in the air. Camilla continued, "Since I left that object with you, my life has become empty. I feel things touching me while I sleep, lights that turn on in the dark, voices that speak my mother-in-law's name, but in languages I don't know. He doesn't want me to forget. He wants me to return it. But you are the one who holds the key." Isabel tried to close the door, but her eyes fell on the cross Camilla was holding. It wasn't ordinary. It was made of 2 pieces of darkened wood, joined with black thread. It smelled of wet earth, and in the center of the cross hung a small dried drop of blood. Camilla noticed the terror on Isabel's face and murmured, "You know what this is, don't you? I brought it to him, so he can take what's his. And what's with you, if it's not yours, will be taken away by force." Isabel felt her body weaken. A heavy nausea invaded her stomach. The mark on her left arm burned. The altar candles went out on their own. The mirror at the back of the room cracked with a crash. And the reliquary, the golden one, opened by itself. No smoke came out of it, no light, but a silent energy spread through the air, and for a second Isabel saw Camilla's husband's face reflected in the glass. He didn't smile, he didn't cry, he just stared, with eyes that begged, "Release." Isabel staggered. She fell to her knees. She tried to apologize, but her voice wouldn't come out. Camilla simply turned and said before leaving, "If you don't give it back, he'll charge you. Not me, you, because you're the one who's left with the pain." And as she closed the door, Isabel saw on the floor at her feet something that wasn't there before, the silver reliquary, her husband's mother's. She couldn't remember where she'd left it, but now it was there, cold, heavy, and with the same dark stain she'd had on her arm. That night, Isabel couldn't sleep, and for the first time in months, the golden reliquary closed. But inside her, a new pain arose. Not physical, not emotional. It was something deeper, as if a debt had been transferred to his soul. In the room where Isabel performed her rituals, there was an antique painting of the Virgin Mary. It was an inheritance from her grandmother, hanging there since the house was merely a dwelling of simple prayers and homely blessings. The serene image, with eyes that seemed to follow the steps of those who entered, was considered sacred by many and feared by some. In recent days, Isabel had noticed something strange. The painting seemed different. The saint's eyes were darker, as if the paint had rotted. Her mouth seemed less sweet, more rigid, as if the image were moving away from devotion and sinking into silent lamentation. But she chose to ignore it. The morning after Camilla's visit, Isabel woke to the strong smell of iron. She thought it was blood. She got up shakily, her stomach churning. As she entered the living room, her legs felt weak. The painting of the Virgin Mary cried. They were thick, red drops, slowly trickling down the image's eyes. The blood ran in thin rivulets, marking the painted face with lines that crossed the cheeks and fell to the ground. It wasn't paint, it wasn't seepage, it was real blood, vivid, thick, still warm. Frightened, Isabel tried to clean it, cloth after cloth, to no avail. The blood returned, as if it was springing from the image's very gaze, and most disturbing, did not appear in filming. She recorded it on her cell phone, and everything seemed normal. But when she saw it in person, tears flowed like silent witnesses to a mistake that could no longer be hidden. That night, Elizabeth attempted a ritual of atonement. She relit black candles. She circled the reliquary with coarse salt. She wrote Camilla's name and burned it on the ritual charcoal. But the fire wouldn't catch. The name refused to burn, and for the first time the prayer stuck in her throat. She coughed harder, until blood gushed from her mouth and onto the table. And where the blood touched, the golden reliquary glowed for a moment. Isabel fell to the floor, and from the painting, a soft voice echoed through the room. "You used me as a shield, but you never served me truly." The words didn't come from a spirit. They didn't seem to echo from another dimension. They were an internal presence, as if the very egregore of the faith she had pretended to profess for years was now judging her. She crawled to the altar. She knelt. She begged for forgiveness. And then, amidst the darkness, a new detail appeared in the painting. The Virgin now had a second face, superimposed, almost invisible, but real. A second pair of eyes, dark and deep-set, observing from behind the sacred, as if another presence lived there, hidden between layers of faith and manipulation. It was a reflection of what Isabel had done with everything, transformed faith into a mask. The next morning, the neighbor who was passing by the house noticed the open window. And for a second, she said she saw the image of the saint inside the house, looking at her. But it wasn't the Virgin Mary. It was someone with hollow eyes, a dry smile, holding a stained reliquary in her lap. When Isabel tried to remove the painting from the wall, it wouldn't budge. It was stuck, not by nails, but by an invisible spiritual force, as if it had taken root in the wall itself. She called a bricklayer. The man tried to help, but when he touched the painting, fainted with a seizure. Upon waking, he said he dreamed of a woman in a burnt dress, kneeling on an inverted cross, asking for eternal silence. After that, Elizabeth locked the room. She placed black cloths in the cracks in the door. She built a new altar in the room, but she knew it was useless. Blood was seeping out from under the wood, and the saint's eyes watched her from anywhere in the house. For weeks, Isabel endured the burden of living amidst presences, pains, and ceaseless whispers. The house no longer felt like hers. Every mirror reflected something that wasn't there. Every dark corner whispered a name she didn't recognize. And the reliquary now no longer needed to be touched to act. It was the heart of it all, the center, the portal. It was then that Isabel decided the unthinkable, would sell the object. He sought contacts on occult forums, collectors of sacred objects, and antique dealers specializing in religious items. He disguised its origin, omitted its origins, and claimed it was an ancient relic used by Eastern European healers with rare symbolism and intense spiritual power, a unique artifact. The response came quickly. An interested buyer from São Paulo, willing to pay in cash. A reserved man, a collector of objects that test the limits of faith, as he wrote in the message. They scheduled the meeting for 3 days later. Isabel carefully wrapped the reliquary in 7 layers of anointed cloth. She buried a wooden cross next to it to break the connection, as if it still held some power over him. But on the eve of delivery, the phone rang. "Isabel, this is the daughter of Mr. Marcello, the collector." The voice trembled. "He had an accident. His car rolled over. He didn't even make it out of town. He said he felt a strong presence in the back seat, something cold, something breathing." Isabella hung up without answering. He ran to the altar. The reliquary was still there, in the same place, on the same cloth. But now there was a crack in the glass, and inside, the stained fabric seemed to have absorbed something new. A darker shade, almost black. She tried to bury it. She took it to a vacant, deserted lot on the side of the road. She buried it deep, prayed, cried, asked for forgiveness. She returned home feeling a strange lightness, as if a part of her had been forcibly ripped away. But at dawn, he was back, on the shelf, in the same place, untouched. Only now there was something new. The cloth wrapped around the reliquary had disappeared, and beside it lay a handwritten note in firm, curved letters. "I was not made to be replaced. I was made to remember you." The handwriting was her grandmother's. Isabel would recognize that line anywhere. In desperation, she sought out an old acquaintance of her grandmother's, a reclusive woman who lived on a remote farm and was considered a gatekeeper. When she arrived, with the reliquary wrapped in a bag, she could barely speak, but upon opening the package, the woman screamed, splashed holy water around it, and spat on the ground. "You brought here a prison of souls. This is not an object. This is a sentence. Whoever agreed to keep it agreed to pay. You can't sell it, you can't bury it, or you'll be buried with it." Isabel wept. She asked how to break the bond, how to free herself. The answer came harshly. What is not bound by human hands cannot be broken. This reliquary was not created. It was manifested by accumulated pain, by manipulated faith, by distorted truth. And now, it feeds on those who lie to it. She returned home more tired than ever. She lay on the floor. She heard prayers in strange tongues coming from the walls. Lights flickered. The painting wept. But for the first time, she didn't react. I knew there was no point in running away. I knew that selling was impossible. And deep down, I was beginning to understand. She hadn't found the reliquary. The reliquary had found her. In her final days, Isabel barely moved. Her body, once agile and theatrical during the rituals, was now merely a fragile shell for what remained of her consciousness. She spent hours sitting in the center of the room, surrounded by unlit candles, as if waiting for something or someone to arrive to complete what had begun long before the reliquary appeared. The voices didn't stop, but they changed. Now they weren't shouting. They whispered with pity, as if they were witnessing the fall of a priestess who had lost her own faith. Every corner of the house seemed a mirror of the guilt she carried. The paintings darkened on their own. The walls peeled in shapes that resembled faces. Daylight no longer streamed through the windows. Everything seemed immersed in a time that stopped flowing, as if the house had become a space between worlds. It was in a silent dawn that something finally changed. At 3:33 a.m., the kitchen clock started working again, on its own, after months of not working. It didn't tick, but it pulsed, like a heartbeat. Isabel, lying on the living room floor, opened her eyes. Her pupils were dilated. Her face was gaunt. Her skin was pale, but her lips moved on their own, reciting a prayer that wasn't hers, an ancient guttural language difficult to follow, as if someone spoke from within her. The reliquary opened slowly. No hands, no wind, no touch. Nothing emerged from within, no smoke, no visible spirit, but the temperature in the house dropped, the candles went out, and a shadow walked slowly through the rooms. It couldn't be seen with the eyes, but it could be felt. She weighed the air, like the moment before lightning strikes the earth. In the center of the room, the cracked mirror showed Isabel's reflection for the last time. But it wasn't her. It was a woman in a torn tunic, her eyes bandaged, her mouth sewn shut with silver thread. The figure reached out through the glass and touched the reflection's chest. Isabel felt her heart skip a beat. He trembled. He fell to his knees, and silently, he opened his mouth, but no words came out. The voice that he used so much to manipulate, that once echoed security and dominion over the invisible world, had been taken from him. She tried to scream, to beg for forgiveness, to cry out for mercy, but all that came out was silence, a silence laden with weight, as if spirituality itself had decreed her muteness as a final sentence. In the following days, neighbors noticed her disappearance. They called the police. They broke down the door. They found Isabel sitting on the floor, breathing, her eyes open, but she said nothing. She didn't even react. She just held the reliquary on her lap. Doctors said she had fallen into a catatonic state, that the psychological trauma had left her irreversibly silent, but no one could explain the symbols scratched into the living room floor, nor the dried blood dripping from the painting of the Virgin Mary. No one could explain why. Every night at 3:33 a.m., the hallway light would come on, even with the wires cut. And the reliquary? He was taken by the experts, but he disappeared before arriving at the laboratory. Investigators say he never existed. However, the forensic report records a dark circular stain on Isabel's lap, shaped like an ancient seal, like a signature. Today, she lives in a clinic, in absolute silence. She doesn't speak, she doesn't write, she just stares into space. But all the nurses report the same thing. During the early hours of the morning, Isabel whispers, but not in her own voice. They are other people's voices, from different languages, from different centuries, and one of Them one night said clearly in Latin, lying is the most dangerous ritual, because in it the true name is hidden. Since then, no one has entered room 23 alone.